The music was still playing when Lord Julian Ashwell, Earl of Ashwell, crossed the length of the concert room in 3 deliberate strides and stopped beside the pianoforte. Every conversation ceased. Every fan stilled. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward the tall, angular figure standing at the instrument's edge, and toward the young woman seated at the keys, with her hands folded in her lap, and her chin lifted at precisely the angle of someone who has decided not to be ashamed. He said her name. He said it correctly, every syllable placed where it belonged, in a room full of people who had been saying it wrong for 3 months. What came next changed the shape of the season entirely. To understand it, one must go back to the beginning. To a ball at the end of October when the candlelight was warm, and the room was already full of verdicts, and a young woman in a gown, trimmed for the 3rd time in 3 years, walked through a door that the room had already decided was not for her. Lady Mercer's ballroom ran the full length of the house's east wing, and in the 2nd week of the season, it held perhaps 60 guests, which was considered intimate by the standards of the great families, and crowded to the point of breathlessness by every other measure. The chandeliers threw light that was flattering to diamonds and merciless to plain muslin. The flowers were hothouse roses, white and deep red together, and their fragrance competed with powder and warm beeswax, and the particular close heat of many bodies arranged in prescribed proximity. Thomasina entered behind her distant cousin, Mr. Hargreaves, who had agreed to escort her with the distracted benevolence of a man doing a small favor he expected to cost him nothing. She wore a gown of pale ivory muslin that had been her best gown in her 1st season, her 2nd best in her 2nd, and was now a careful reconstruction. The hem retrimmed with a narrow band of ivory ribbon that almost matched, the sleeves altered to a slightly more current fashion by her own hand at 11 o'clock the night before. She had her mother's pearl earrings, which were genuine and small, and her late father's name, which was Kowalski, and which the season had treated as a problem requiring management since the first morning she had attempted to leave a card. She was 23 years old. Her father, Professor Andrei Kowalski, had opened a music academy on a quiet street in Marylebone 7 years before his death, and the academy had been the most concrete expression of everything he believed about what music was for. He had believed it was for everyone willing to work. He had believed it was for the frightened child and the uncertain adult, and the young woman whose family could not afford a private master. He had not believed, as it happened, that it was necessary to keep careful accounts, and the result was that he had left his daughter an academy she loved, and a debt of £400 she could not pay. £400. The figure had arrived in a solicitor's letter, signed by one Mr. Aldous Prentice, in the same week that Thomasina had agreed to attend the season at Mr. Hargreaves's vague suggestion that she might make a useful connection. The letter was brief and not unkind. Mr. Prentice had explained that the debt was owed to the building's owner, a Mr. Sewell of Chancery Lane, and that Mr. Sewell had indicated his willingness to wait until the spring, which was generous by the standards of Chancery Lane and terrifying by the standards of Thomasina, who had precisely £42 to her name and a season's worth of borrowed time. She had folded the letter into her father's old writing desk, laid her hands flat on the lid for a moment, and then gone to alter her sleeves. The ballroom received her the way large rooms receive people who are not expected. The machinery of notice simply did not engage. The conversations already underway continued around her. A young baronet near the door looked at her face for a fraction of a second, and then looked toward the door again, as though she might be the advance notice of someone more interesting. Lady Mercer herself, stationed near the entrance to receive her guests, said, "How charming," in the tone one uses for people whose names one has not retained, and immediately turned to greet the couple behind. Thomasina took a glass of ratafia from a passing footman and did not drink it. She stood with her back against a pilaster and watched the room with the disciplined attention she had learned as a child at her father's piano. The attention that catalogues rather than judges, that takes in the precise angle of a woman's fan and the exact quality of silence between two people pretending not to look at each other. It was from this position that she first saw him. Lord Julian Ashwell stood at the far end of the room near the alcove where a small pianoforte had been positioned for the evening's entertainment. He was not speaking to anyone. He was perhaps 32 years old, and he stood with a stillness that was not the stillness of ease, but of long practice, of a man who had learned to require very little of the room around him. His face was angular and closed, his jaw carrying a quality the candlelight made almost severe. He wore his dark coat with the precision of someone for whom clothing was a system rather than an ornament, and his eyes, which were the gray of river water before rain, were moving across the room in the slow, deliberate way of a man taking inventory. They passed over Thomasina without pausing. She told herself this was expected. She told herself she had come to make a connection that might save her father's academy, not to be noticed by earls. She told herself the ratafia was better than it smelled. She did not entirely believe any of it. His name she already knew. Lord Julian Ashwell, Earl of Ashwell, heir to a modest fortune and an immodest estate called Ashwell Park in Wiltshire, and the subject of a specific kind of whisper that passed among the season's mothers and daughters, like a letter handed carefully from hand to hand. He had been engaged once, some 4 years prior, to a Miss Caroline Whitmore, who had subsequently and publicly accepted the Marquess of Daventry, who held a higher title and a considerably larger estate. Julian had not been seen in London for the 2 seasons following. He had returned this year with precisely the expression of a man who had decided London was a professional obligation rather than a pleasure, and the room's collective instinct was to treat him with a reverence calibrated partly to his rank and partly to the sense that he might simply leave if the experience proved insufficiently worthwhile. The Dowager Lady Dorothea Ashwell, Julian's mother, sat in state near the south wall with Miss Cecily Frayne arranged at her left hand like an exhibit. Lady Dorothea was a handsome woman in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair dressed very high and a fan she held at a height that conveyed, to anyone fluent in the language, that she was not open to approaches from below a certain social altitude. Miss Cecily was everything the season recommended. 20 years old, fair, the daughter of Sir Edmund Frayne of Devonshire, and possessed of the kind of composed beauty that looks exactly like what it is, a quality that has been carefully tended since childhood by everyone around it. She sat with her hands folded over an ivory fan, and she smiled when smiled at, and she did not once look at Thomasina. The dancing began. Thomasina remained by her pilaster. Mr. Hargreaves danced 2 sets with other partners, and once brought her a second glass of ratafia, which she also did not drink, and then he was absorbed into a card room, and she did not see him again for 2 hours. It was during the 3rd set that the storm arrived. It came from the north, fast and cold for October, and it struck the house with a crack of thunder so immediate that several ladies cried out, and one of the hothouse candles guttered wildly in a sudden draught from somewhere in the house's older bones. The children who had been allowed to watch the dancing from the gallery above were hurried toward the nursery by their nursemaids. But one of them, a girl of perhaps 6 years, with dark plaited hair, had separated from the group in the confusion and found her way instead to the small room at the corridor's end where the pianoforte alcove opened into a narrow anteroom, and she was sitting on the floor behind the instruments bench with her knees drawn to her chest when the second crack of thunder shook the window panes. Thomasina heard her. She had left the ballroom not for the child, but for air. Walking the corridor with the careful composure of a woman who has decided to need nothing from the room behind her. She heard the small sound through the anteroom door, a thin, high noise that was not quite crying, but was very close to it. And she opened the door without thinking about whether it was her business. The girl looked up at her with enormous dark eyes and said nothing. Thomasina sat down on the bench, turned toward the keys, and began to play. She played a lullaby her father had taught her when she was barely older than the child before her. A Polish melody with a long, slow right-hand line and a left hand that moved in gentle rocking intervals underneath it. The piano was a decent instrument, an older Broadwood with a warm middle register, and in the small room with the storm pressing against the window glass, it carried exactly the quality she intended, something between shelter and company. The girl uncurled slowly from the floor. By the second repetition, she had moved to stand beside the bench. By the third, she had laid one small hand on the piano's side and was listening with the focused attention of someone being held without being touched. What Thomasina did not know was that the doorway behind her was not empty. Julian had stepped into the corridor during the thunder's second assault, not from fear, but from the instinct of a man accustomed to checking the perimeter of any space he occupied. He had seen the anteroom door ajar. He had heard the piano. He had stood in the doorway for the full 3 repetitions of the lullaby, long enough to observe the child's hand moving from the floor to the bench's edge, long enough to see the particular quality of concentration in the young woman's back and shoulders, the total commitment to the instrument and the small audience before her that left no portion of herself reserved for performance. He did not enter the room. He did not announce himself. He stood in the doorway until the child's nurse appeared at the corridor's far end with a lamp and a frantic expression, and then he stepped back into the shadow and let them find each other. He returned to the ballroom. He did not cross toward the pianoforte alcove. He stationed himself near the window as the storm began to ease and the dancing resumed, and when Thomasina reappeared from the corridor 20 minutes later, he was looking at the window glass, and his expression was impossible to read. And the room saw nothing in this, because the room had decided long since that Lord Ashwell's expression was always impossible to read. A woman near Thomasina said, in a voice pitched for her companion but carrying further than intended, "Poor thing. A Polish tradesman's daughter, they say. One wonders what the cousin was thinking. Bringing her." Thomasina heard it. She had been hearing variations of it since the first morning card, and she had developed, over 3 months, a specific technique for the moment of impact. She let it arrive. She registered it fully, and then she folded it into the same drawer as the solicitor's letter, and continued. She continued. Lady Dorothea had observed Thomasina's return from the corridor with the patient attention of a woman whose business is the assessment of irregularities. She said something to Cecily behind her fan. Cecily's expression did not change, which was its own kind of comment. 3 days later, at a dinner given by Mrs. Alcott of Portman Square, Lady Dorothea made her opening move. The table held 14 guests, and the seating placed Thomasina at the far end from Julian, near a quietly desperate baronet's wife named Mrs. Felton, who asked 3 times whether the soup was cold. Lady Dorothea was at the table's midpoint, positioned to speak across several guests without raising her voice impolitely, and she did so at the remove of the fish course, directing a remark toward Lord Felton on the subject of the season's musical entertainments. "I understand Miskowski plays," Lady Dorothea said, looking down the table with an expression of courteous interest. One of the young ladies was speaking of it. The name arrived in the room's acoustics as something shortened and altered, the central vowel flattened, the second syllable lost entirely, the word reduced to something that sounded vaguely Scandinavian and entirely uncertain of itself. Thomasina looked up. "Kowalski," she said. with the precision of someone who has had practice making the correction without heat. The W is pronounced as a V in Polish. It is my father's name. Lady Dorothea inclined her head with the gracious patience of a woman correcting a pupil. Of course, she said. Forgive me. She did not repeat the name. Julian had heard the exchange from his position 3 seats down. He said nothing. His fork moved with its ordinary precision. But Thomasina, looking back at her plate, did not see the quality of attention with which his eyes had moved briefly to the end of the table, and then returned, quite deliberately, to his wine glass. The season's charity concert was announced the following week. It was to be held in the great room of Mercer House on the 15th of November, and the entertainment was to consist of amateur performances by several of the season's guests, with a professional quartet in attendance for the evening's second half. Lady Mercer had suggested, through Mrs. Alcott, that Miss Kowalski might play. The suggestion arrived as a compliment with a secondary purpose, and Thomasina understood both. Her father's academy gave her a skill the season found ornamental when properly framed. And Lady Mercer, who was not unkind, had arranged the thing as a way of giving her a platform that would cost nothing to anyone of consequence. She accepted. Lady Dorothea learned of it the same afternoon. She also learned, through the mechanism of the season's interconnected drawing rooms, that Julian had attended the small literary evening at the Alcotts, at which Thomasina had been present, and that he had sat in a chair closer to the window than the occasion required, and that he had spoken to her directly for approximately 4 minutes about her father's method of teaching scales to beginners, a conversation that no one had overheard in its entirety, but that several people had observed in its physical aspect, which is to say, he had been turned fully toward her, and he had listened. This information organized Lady Dorothea's thinking with considerable efficiency. The fabricated scandal arrived on the 12th of November, 3 days before the concert. It came in the form of a story, passed through Lady Mercer's drawing room by a woman named Mrs. Croft, who was not malicious but who was deeply suggestible, and who had been told by someone she trusted, which was Lady Dorothea, that there were questions about the propriety of the academy in Marylebone. Not specific questions. The shapeless kind, the kind that arrives as an atmosphere, a hesitation before a name is spoken, a comment about one's sympathy for anyone in such a position. The questions implied that the academy's irregular finances might reflect something beyond poor accounting, and that Professor Kowalski's cosmopolitan associations, a phrase Lady Dorothea had apparently used with considerable delicacy, might have been of a kind that reflected on his daughter's reputation by simple proximity. It was precisely the sort of scandal that dissolves under examination and devastates before examination becomes possible. Thomasina heard it from Mrs. Felton, who told her with the genuine distress of a woman who believed she was doing a kindness over tea at a table in the back room of a linen draper's in Bond Street, where no one could overhear but where the information seemed to require communicating urgently. She sat very still for a moment after Mrs. Felton finished speaking. My father, she said carefully, was a music teacher from Krakow, who came to London because he believed in what he was doing. He kept poor accounts. He was kind to every student who ever sat at his piano, regardless of what they could afford to pay. The debt on the academy is £400, which is a great deal to me, and would not be to most men in this room. There is nothing else. Mrs. Felton patted her hand and said she was sure that was so. The same afternoon, Mr. Prentice wrote again. Mr. Sewell had revised his willingness to wait. The debt was now called for before the new year. Thomasina read the letter in the narrow hallway of the lodging house where she had been staying since the season began, and she stood for a moment looking at the wall. The wall was papered in a faded pattern of small blue flowers. 3 of them in a row near the skirting board had come away at the seam. She folded the letter. She put on her coat. She went to Ashwell House. She had not been invited. She knew this. She also knew that what she had to say could not be managed through the season's machinery of cards and calls and third-party communications, and that the story Lady Dorothea had seeded would reach Julian before she did if she waited for an invitation. She gave her name to the footman at the door with a composure she did not entirely feel, and she waited in the front hall under a portrait of a woman in Elizabethan dress who looked, Thomasina thought, as though she also had found it necessary to arrive somewhere uninvited. Julian came down the stairs in his riding coat, clearly on his way out. He stopped on the 4th step when he saw her. She did not let the silence extend. "Your Grace," she said, and then corrected herself with the practiced efficiency of someone who has made a point of learning the correct forms. "My lord, I am here without invitation, and I will not stay long. You have likely heard a story about my father's academy, and about me. I want to tell you what is actually true before the story hardens into the version you will be offered by others." He came down the remaining 4 steps and stopped in front of her at a distance that was correct and gave away nothing. He said, "Go on." She told him. She told him about the £400, about Mr. Sewell's letter, about the nature of her father's accounting and the nature of his teaching, which had produced, over 12 years, approximately 200 students who had learned to play instruments they would not otherwise have touched. She told him about the Polish lullaby her father had taught her in a room above Krakow before she was old enough to read the notes. She told him that Lady Dorothea's story was a construction, and that she understood its purpose, and that she did not blame anyone for the season's machinery, but that she would not pretend the machinery did not exist. She told him she expected nothing from this conversation. She told him that she wanted to say it to his face, rather than through an intermediary, because he had looked at her, once at a pianoforte alcove, and once more in Mrs. Alcott's dining room, and once in a chair by a window, and she had each time had the impression, which she was very likely mistaken about, that he was actually looking. When she finished, Julian said nothing for a moment. His face had not changed in any manner she could catalogue. He was standing very still in the way she had observed from across ballrooms, and his hands were at his sides, and she could not read him at all. "Thank you," he said finally, "for coming." It was not absolution. It was not a promise. She nodded, retrieved her gloves from the hall table, and left. She told herself, walking back through the gray November afternoon, that she had done what she could, that she had not performed, that she had given him the truth in its plainest form, and that whatever he did with it was his to decide. She told herself the academy might yet be saved by some other means. She told herself the concert was in 3 days, and she would play well, because playing well was what she knew how to do. She was not entirely certain she believed any of it. He had stood in his front hall for some time after she left, which the footman later mentioned to Mrs. Holt with the mild puzzlement of a young man observing something he could not classify. His hand had gone, briefly, and without apparent awareness, to his coat pocket, where nothing was kept. In the room on the 1st floor of Ashwell House, where Julian worked in the evenings, there was a portrait. It was a small painting, a 3/4 view of a fair-haired woman of perhaps 20, very beautifully executed, and it hung on the wall beside the bookcase in the position of something that had been placed, and then, at some point, turned. The canvas faced the wall. It had faced the wall for 4 years. He was aware of it in the way one is aware of a door one has decided not to open. And he had not decided even now to open it. What Thomasina had done in coming to his house without an invitation had not resolved anything. He knew this. The debt was real. The season's verdict was real. Lady Dorothea's reach was real, and her investment in Cecily Frayne was real, and the logic of the arrangement she was constructing was entirely legible to him, as it was meant to be. He also knew what he had heard from a doorway in October, when a young woman he had not been introduced to had sat down at a borrowed piano and played a Polish lullaby for a frightened child in a room where no one was watching. He knew what kind of person that required her to be. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had once been very badly mistaken about what a person's public behavior indicated of their private character, that he had not been mistaken this time. He had been engaged to Caroline Whitmore for 11 months. He had trusted her with the specific trust of a man who had decided that trust was the only thing that justified marriage, that the entire enterprise was built on the willingness to believe in someone's honesty before it was proven. He had been wrong. She had been very kind about it, in the drawing room in front of the 6 people he most respected in the world, and her kindness had been the worst part. The portrait faced the wall. He went to the window. Outside, the street held its November quiet. The carriages moving slowly on the damp stones. A flower seller at the corner with her basket closed against the cold. He stood there for a long time. Lady Dorothea's third movement came on the morning of the concert. She had asked Thomasina to call through a correctly worded note delivered to the lodging house with a footman in Ashwell livery. The call was framed as a social gesture, an interest in the evening's program, a wish to speak with the young lady who would be performing. Thomasina went because she had no rational basis for refusing and because she wished to see clearly whatever Lady Dorothea intended her to see. Lady Dorothea received her in a morning room furnished in pale gray and ivory. Cecily Frayne was present, seated at the window with a piece of needlework, which Thomasina suspected she had placed herself rather than been placed. The dowager was gracious, which was more difficult to manage than if she had been cold. "Miss Kowski," Lady Dorothea said, with the comfortable precision of a woman who has decided a name is not worth learning correctly. "I am glad you came. I wanted to speak to you frankly, as I would to any young woman in your position." Thomasina said, "My name is Kowalski." Lady Dorothea smiled with one corner of her mouth. "Of course. My son is a man of unusual sensibilities. He has always been drawn to the interesting case, the irregular situation. It is a quality I find admirable in him, in the proper context." She went on for some time. She spoke about Julian's need for a suitable establishment, about the demands of Ashwell Park, about the considerable requirements of a countess's position. She spoke about Cecily's qualifications with the practiced generosity of a woman who does not need to enumerate them because the room already understands them. She spoke about the academy debt, which she knew the precise figure of, and about Mr. Sewell's revised position, which she also knew. She said, with her fan held at its measured height, "A man in my son's position cannot attach himself to something that requires rescuing. You understand? I am sure." Thomasina looked at her for a moment. She thought of the solicitor's letter. She thought of her father's piano in the Marylebone Academy, its keys worn to a particular smoothness in the treble from 12 years of young hands finding the notes. She thought of what she had said in Julian's front hall, and the quality of his silence afterward, and the fact that she had told him she expected nothing. She had meant it. She still meant it. "I understand you very well," she said. She stood, and she was not shaking, which surprised her a little. "I thank you for the clarity." She put on her gloves. "I shall play well tonight." She left without curtsying, which was a small act of precision rather than rudeness, and she did not permit herself to assess what it might cost her until she was outside in the November air, where it cost her nothing visible to anyone. The concert room at Mercer House was laid with 60 chairs arranged in 8 rows, and by the time the first performer took the stage, the rows were full, and there was a small standing contingent near the doors. The candles were arranged close to the instrument, so that the pianist would play in a pool of warm light with the audience in relative dimness behind it, which was the convention, and which Thomasina was grateful for. She was the third performer. She had chosen her father's transcription of a Clementi sonata, which she had been playing since she was 14, and a short piece of her own composition that she had never played in public before, which was a risk she had decided to take on the basis that if this was to be her last public performance of the season, she wished it to mean something. She sat down at the Broadwood concert instrument, which was better than the alcove piano had been, and she placed her hands on the keys. And for a moment, the room was completely still. She played. The Clementi was exact and clean, the kind of playing that demonstrates what the player learned before the age of 12, and has not since unlearned. The short original piece was something else. It had the same long right-hand line as her father's lullaby, but in a minor key and at a slower tempo, and it moved through a sequence of variations that had no program except the one she had been living since October, the particular quality of a year in which one has been consistently passed over and has continued anyway. It was not self-pity. Her father had taught her the difference. It was more like an accurate report from a specific interior, played with total precision and no reservation. The room listened. She had not expected this. She had expected polite attention and the ordinary sounds of an audience managing its patience between pieces, the small coughs, the restrained conversations, the rustle of programs. Instead, there was something she had not heard in a room for some time, which was silence of the held variety, the kind that means the thing is still happening. She finished. She lifted her hands. The applause began correctly at the front and spread. She stood and turned, and it was in the act of turning that she registered the quality of the room's attention, which had shifted from the polite to something older and less managed. Faces she had been looking past for 3 months were turned toward her with expressions she did not know how to read. Lady Dorothea, in the 3rd row, had her fan still. Julian was standing. He was at the side of the room, near the wall, which was where he had positioned himself for the entire concert, and he was on his feet with his hands very still at his sides and his face showing something she had not seen on it before, which was not exactly emotion and was not exactly its absence, but was the kind of thing that happens to a face when the barrier it has been maintaining encounters something it cannot classify. The applause continued. It deepened. She did not know what he was going to do. She had told him she expected nothing, and she had meant it. And meaning it now felt like the most costly thing she had ever done, because it was possible to mean something, and to find that meaning it hurt exactly as much as hoping would have. He moved. He crossed the room in 3 strides, and the music that had already begun its transition to the evening's second half, the quartet raising their bows behind her, simply stopped. The players lowered their instruments. The room understood, collectively and without instruction, that something was happening that required attention. Julian stopped beside the pianoforte. He looked at her for a moment, long enough for the room to understand that he was looking at her specifically, with the particular quality of attention that is entirely unlike the glance that slides away. The candlelight was close and warm, and it showed everything. "Thomasina Kowalski," he said. He said it to the room. He said it the way her father had said it, every syllable exact, the W like a V, the second vowel open, the final syllable clear. Not Kowski. Not the softened, emptied reduction Lady Dorothea had been distributing across the season like a small, persistent insult. Her name, correct and complete, spoken at a volume the 8th row could hear. "I am asking," he said, "if you will permit me to call on you tomorrow morning." A formal call. In the language of the season, it was a statement. A formal call from an earl, announced publicly, in the same room where the season's verdict had been delivered and reinforced and delivered again, was a recalibration. It was a public instruction to the hierarchy to revise its reading. He was not finished. "Your father's academy," he said, "is not in debt." He said it quietly, as though the information were simply factual, which it was, as of that morning, when he had visited Mr. Aldous Prentice's offices in Chancery Lane and arranged the settlement of £400 against the Academy's obligation to Mr. Sewell. He had told Prentice that the settlement should be conducted in the Academy's name, not his, and Prentice had nodded with the professional composure of a solicitor who has seen stranger instructions and found them none of his business. "Mr. Prentice will confirm it." From the 3rd row, Thomasina heard a small sound she could not immediately identify. She looked. It was Lady Dorothea, who had opened her fan, not for use but for something to hold, and whose expression showed, for the first time in 3 months, something other than calibrated confidence. The confidence had not collapsed. It had simply encountered a wall it had not accounted for, and was, quietly and with great dignity, recognizing the fact. Cecily Frayne, seated 2 chairs to the dowager's left, looked across the room at Thomasina with an expression that was not hostile and was not warm, but was unmistakably honest. The expression of a young woman who has understood that the field has reorganized around someone else. She looked down at her program. She did not look up again. From near the door, Mrs. Holt's voice carried across the room's breathless quiet, precise and unhurried, as she confirmed to the woman beside her that the concert was public, that 60 guests were in attendance, and that she herself had been present from the beginning of the evening. It was a single sentence, entirely factual, and it was aimed at no one in particular, and at everyone in general, and it landed in the room exactly as it was meant to. Thomasina looked at Julian. He was watching her with his hands at his sides, and his face showing everything it had not shown in 3 months of calculated stillness. The wound in him was still there. She could see it. The particular quality of a man who has been careful, because carefulness was the price of continuing. She understood it. She had been paying the same price in a different currency for 3 months and longer. "Yes," she said. "You may call." The season understood what had happened. It would take the season approximately 36 hours to reorganize its assessments into their new configuration, during which time a number of carefully composed notes would be written and dispatched across Mayfair, and 2 invitations would be extended to Thomasina for events she had not previously been invited to, and Lady Mercer would tell Mrs. Alcott that she had always thought the girl was worth watching, and Mrs. Alcott would agree with the equanimity of a woman who has never once admitted to having thought otherwise. None of this was justice, exactly. It was the season operating according to its own logic, which is to say it followed the most powerful signal in the room and adjusted accordingly. But Julian had chosen Ashwell Park's signal, and the room had chosen to follow it, and the result, while procedural, was real. He called the next morning. He called the morning after that. By the end of November, the understanding between them had been reached in the measured language of 2 people who have each learned, through specific and painful instruction, to be more exact about what they mean than ordinary conversation requires. He told her about Caroline. He did not perform the telling. He described what had happened with the directness of a man who has decided that this particular truth, at least, deserves to be carried in the open air for once. She listened without filling the silences he left. This was the thing about him she had understood from the alcove, from the doorway, from the 4 minutes at the Alcott's window. He was a man whose silences contained more than his sentences, and one could read both or neither, but not one without the other. By December, the formal understanding had been conveyed to the appropriate parties. Lady Dorothea received the news in her morning room with the composure of a woman who has always known how to absorb a reversal without indicating that she has registered it as one. She did not, in any subsequent drawing-room appearance, mispronounce anyone's name. Whether this was a consequence of conscience or of the season's realignment was a question that the season itself found pleasantly unresolvable. Mr. Prentice wrote to confirm the Academy's debt cleared. He used the precise language of a solicitor's confirmation, which is to say he wrote 4 sentences and no more, but the 4 sentences contained, among their other functions, the information that the Academy was secure, that Mr. Sewell had been satisfied in full, and that the building's continued use for musical instruction was documented in the settlement's terms. Thomasina read the letter twice. She folded it into her father's writing desk, beside the original debt notice, and she laid her hands on the lid. They drove to Ashwell Park on a morning in late December, when the first snow of the year was falling on Wiltshire in the particular way of snow that has decided to stay. The estate came into view as the carriage turned through the eastern gate, and Thomasina saw it for the first time in winter light. The stone of the house gray-white and quietly enormous. The gardens under their first thin covering of snow. The home farm's roof lines just visible beyond the east wall. She did not perform a response to it. She took it in the way she took in anything that required careful attention. Mrs. Holt met them in the entrance hall with the steady authority of a woman who has been keeping this house in order for 23 years and expects to keep it in order for 23 more. She looked at Thomasina with the direct assessment of someone who has been watching from doorways and drawing her own conclusions for longer than anyone in the room was aware. And then she said, with a warmth that was entirely genuine and entirely unsentimental, "The fire is laid in the music room, miss. I had it done this morning." Julian took her coat. He did it himself, which was notable, and he did it with a care that was not about the coat. She stood for a moment in the entrance hall under the portraits of people who had lived in this house before him and would presumably be inherited along with everything else, and she felt, for the first time in 3 months, the specific quality of a room that was not assessing her. The music room was at the house's south end, with 3 windows that looked over the garden toward the low hills beyond. The pianoforte was a Clementi, older than the Broadwood but in fine condition, its ivory keys worn to a particular smoothness in the treble that she recognized, because she knew what it meant. Someone had played this instrument for a long time, and played it well, and loved it. She sat down on the bench. Her hands found their position on the keys. The fire was warm behind her. Outside, the snow was coming down in steady silence against the garden. She could hear it in the way one hears snow when a room is quiet enough, not as a sound but as an absence of other sounds, a general softening of the world's harder edges. Julian came to stand near the window. He was not watching her hands, or the keys, or the fire. He was looking at her face. She began to play. She played the Polish lullaby first, because it was her father's, and because this seemed the right room to return it to, a room that knew what it was for an instrument to be used until it wore. The slow right-hand line moved through the room's good acoustics, unhurried, and the left hand rocked beneath it in its familiar intervals. When she finished, Julian crossed to the wall beside the bookcase and turned the portrait face forward. He did not explain. He did not need to. The woman in the painting looked out of the frame with the pleasant, composed expression of a woman who had had a long time to be only paint and canvas, and he looked at her for a moment, with no expression that was readable as either grief or anger. And then he looked at Thomasina, and what was on his face was something that had decided, quietly and without ceremony, that it was finished holding itself at a distance. "Play something else," he said. She played. The snow continued at the window. The fire spoke in its ordinary language at her back. Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed with the domestic sound of a house in which people are going about their business, because the house is working again, because a fire has been laid, and a road has been traveled, and a name has been correctly spoken in front of 60 people who will carry it forward. She played until the light changed. That was how Ashwell Park received her. Not with ceremony, not with announcement, but with warmth. And the specific familiar weight of a room that has been waiting for its piano to be played again. If Thomasina's story moved you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that stayed with you longest. This channel is built on stories like hers, and every comment tells us you are here,